So what will it be, folks? Car folks. Oh, it's the Jurowitz. She promises precisely a D0 sandwich for everyone, so maybe she's the most honest to all. Again, the picture seems to say otherwise. There's Cash Man over there. He's got his cash ready for us. Freeland is nowhere to be seen around here. It's not her district. Freeland district. Not sure about grants where they are around here. Not too much green. The trees here still. But cha-ching. Just want to clarify a couple of things from that rambling tirade about Proudhon, or Proudhon, as I like to call him, the proud one, proud Fourier modifier or whatever he was. I think Marx was a lot too harsh on him for anxiety influence reasons. And just wanted to be right about everything, which he was right about a lot of things. I think Marx was, but he had a gun fetish. But that's a long story. We'll deal with that later. But something I found yesterday that I didn't even mention, or maybe I did, maybe in passing, but maybe not the concept, because he talked so much about Godwin there, who, compared to this guy, in my opinion, is a bit of a goof. He's a lightweight next to Prince Kropotkin here. Mutual aid. And I mean, just calling Godwin a lightweight like that, I know those are, that's kind of a trashy way of putting it, but I mean, Kropotkin is a force of nature to be reckoned with when it comes to anarchist argumentation and practice. For one, you're getting a lot closer to a responsible attitude towards the natural sciences, and in Kropotkin's case, then you would in Godwin, is what I mean, because what you got in Godwin is still this Enlightenment arch rationalism. There's a little, there's a lot actually. It's very top-heavy with this progressive sort of, human rationality, guaranteeing progress. There's not much by way of evidential support or inductive reasoning attempts, at least in the construction of his argument, whereas Kropotkin was coming head on against the social Darwinists, the earliest social Darwinists, including certain very unfortunate, maybe many unfortunate passages in Darwin's work itself, The Origin of Species, and especially that other one. After that, what was that called? The Descent of Man? The Ascent of Man? Descent of Man. Yeah, it's definitely descending by the looks of it. Anyways, the key claim in that biological theory that Kropotkin is famously just completely eviscerating in this classic text, Mutual Aid: A Factor of Evolution, from 1886, or it was written over the course of 4 or 5 years, I believe. We've got a beautiful introduction by George Woodcock, a now dead, now passed on anarcho-literary man from the occupied region known as scare quotes Canada, and scare quotes British, double scare quotes Columbia somewhere, Victoria Borea or something like that. That crappy band old guys know me's knows from, I think. Well, whatever. It's neither here nor there, but it's a very nice addition is all I'm trying to say. Could have used kind of a less personality cultish picture, I think, than big old bearded Kropotkin there, but it's kind of cool. Blue. So where was I? Oh yeah, so what he's tackling head on, and really I think decisively eviscerating is this thesis still circulating today in some intellectually and emotionally bankrupt quarters of this sad excuse for the human species that we're still in. The thesis that this so-called struggle for existence is the primary, if not the only, law of natural selection. So in other words, competition, and a very specific kind of competition, no pun intended. Competition, these guys were saying, Darwin and especially so-called, what was his name? They called it, well, T.H. Huxley, a real scoundrel in a lot of ways. Kropotkin's pretty gentle with him, gentler than he has to be, in my opinion, given what that sort of garbage misinterpretation of Darwin led to, including eugenics movements, you know, starting in the States or predominantly and migrating to Nazi Germany with terrifying results that everyone's sort of one-sidedly familiar with, without tending to trace the intellectually bankrupt lineage of these kinds of biofascist misinterpretations of evolution and of species life in general, to to North America in particular. And back to T.H. Huxley there in Britain. Anyways, Kropotkin goes against this whole thing with the concept of mutual aid, which he adduces a lot of empirical observations to establish. The thesis here is that mutual aid is the primary support and the primary motor, if you want to call it that. I don't like these metaphors, but the primary, instinct and or process that allows for virtually any living species to survive, including plants, insects, you know. Some birds are a bit more solitary in their way-making through survival, but these species, Kropotkin provocatively suggests, since they trace back evolutionary-wise before the time of this kind of organized human assault on the natural environment took hold, spread throughout the world, and really continues to this day to seriously disrupt and damage and destroy, literally extinguish, exterminate so many species and relocate them. Whatever competition there is inside of a given species, like imminent competition between members of the same species, generally Kropotkin says this is the exception, not the rule. In nature, when you find a lot of competition between animals of the same species in particular, usually it's as Kropotkin observed, a result of some sort of awful, natural catastrophe or man-made natural catastrophe, in the case of the greenhouse gas chamber of climate change that we've managed to create here and still go along with. So there's that cause of competition where animals or plants or whatever are struggling for scarce resources, but in an ecosystem that isn't compromised in this way by extreme conditions, environmental conditions, whether man-made or not, as the case may be, across times and places. He was also a geologist who made a serious discovery about the formation of continental Asia. Anyways, so I'm really bad at geography. I'm not even gonna get into that, but apparently his theory still stands up. He had a speculation about some sort of tectonic shift that created a mountain formation that hadn't been adequately theorized before Kropotkin went and did the field work. I think it was after he did prison time for his political activities, or maybe it was slightly before. I can't remember. He's got a pretty action-packed life. He started as a prince, as a nobility, not a full-blown prince, I don't think. He's a high-ranking officer of some kind, and one of the anecdotes goes is he visited a labor camp for the first time and pretty much dropped everything when it came to officialdom and became an anarchist. So back to mutual aid. This book is a reinterpretation, also a real pathbreaker when it comes to Western natural science, so-called biological research, in the sense that this text, Mutual Aid, a factor in evolution, is the first kind of work in the Western tradition, at least, that insists on, what does it insist on? Oh yeah, the ecological as a fundamental element of political thought, a fundamental factor, whatever you want to call it, an essential part of articulating a theory or family of theories that take our natural environment far more seriously in a lot of ways, maybe more playfully in a lot of good ways too, the sense that Kropotkin really insists that nature's not our bitch. Nature is not just an ashtray for human beings to exploit. We are a part of it. And the state, particularly the modern state after the medieval period, when you have industrialism, in my view, creating these forces of destruction, these weapons, not just creating, but being enforced by the weapons that it creates, coercion, the possibilities of coercion and destruction that it creates. You've got this situation where human beings have really taken this bankrupt, hubristic, really anti-natural ideology way too far. Even trying to get it off of the ground is already going too far. It's a suicidal idea for a species to be afflicted with this idea that what we like to call culture or civilization is somehow separate, and this is the real doozy, dangerous thought, is that it's somehow superior or better than, nature itself or all of the other organisms besides these, purportedly rational, superior beings called humans. Just because you have a bigger gun, more force at your disposal, violent force in particular, and even if just because you have some sort of squiggly way that you like to make language with these things you call words, even if a dolphin doesn't have words, can you do that echolocation communication underwater thing? Like, did dolphins ever invade and just systematically murder like another group of dolphins in the same species because they had, shorter noses or something, even if they didn't? Like, different shade of gray or something. Like, these stupidities are unique to our species by all appearances, and they are an aberration according to Kropotkin. They're not the norm, and they like to, drill this struggle for existence idea into kids' heads. Maybe not so much anymore, I hope. But they were really doing it aggressively back in Kropotkin's time, and he was ready, philosophical guns a-blazing, as it were, at that Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, that's what they called him. Kropotkin was already barking up that jerk's cowardly pseudo-intellectual edifice as soon as it was erected. I just want to start, or end rather, let's end where we began, let's begin again. It's small knowledge kind of motif. You're never finished, you're always on the way, begin again. The preface for the 1914 edition, 12 years after first edition was published in 1902, as a complete text. Several chapters were all out, I think, by the late 1880s. But in this 1914, just entering into the so-called First World War, I like to call it the Second World War, since the invasion, multiply genocidal occupation ongoing still of the so-called first world, beginning around 1492, just say, with Columbus setting his stinky foot on the soil and looking for gold for some bunch of assholes across the ocean that he didn't even know what continent he was on or whatever. Okay, so where was I again? Oh yeah, so the Second World War is the so-called Great War. I call it the First World War. I think it's it's extremely Eurocentric and racist, because it's not the first time the whole, for all intents and purposes, most are an extremely large proportion of the earth, of the communities of the earth, were engulfed in a horrible, atrocious, violent onslaught. It's the first industrial, I guess, cataclysmic war, which makes it significant, but not the First World War, in my opinion. Anyways, what I wanted to point out here, just as an anticipation as well, for the Kierkegaard video that I promise is coming, it's on Fear and Trembling. In the meantime, for that, you can, if you're interested, the two people that like to listen to this stuff, check into the story of Lucretia, the rape of Lucretia in particular, and the founding of the first so-called Roman Republic after the, 7 kings. The last one was assassinated, and it had to do with particularly a woman who is reputed for her virtue being assaulted by the son of Tarquinius, who was the king at the time, who the anecdote is talking about, the anecdote of Gabii, the destruction of Gabii at the beginning of Fear and Trembling is the epigram. I think something really fascinating that I didn't notice and important is going on kind of silently with this echo figure, this mirror figure of Lucretia, who isn't mentioned by name, but I think there's a case to be made for one of the most mysterious parts of Fear and Trembling, in my view, at the beginning there, where you have this mention. It sounds like he's talking about Sarah, Abraham's wife, but I don't believe there's a direct mention of anyone's name. It's a woman, 4 scenarios of a woman in various ways weaning her child or her baby away from the breast, blackening the breast is his expression, concealing it so that the child has to separate and crawl its way into infancy and adulthood eventually, or whatever. Anyways, I think, with Lucretia, let's just put it this way, she committed suicide in a very public way, almost I think it was an act of great protest, almost like a self-incineration for a cause. But she stabbed herself in the chest, in the heart, out of despair for what happened to her, and anger and outrage, and she told the right people, and it was the end of the Roman monarchy as they knew it, which again relates in a very interesting way to this question of God's promise that he's making Abraham to be the father of an entire people. Some sort of new beginning going on there. I think the parallel with the Roman Empire is very intended, I don't like intentions. Road to hell is paved with intentions, period, good or bad. But anyways, where was I? Trying not to scare the children. Still working on that. All that by way of preparing somehow for the eventual Fear and Trembling. I've just got into a real Kierkegaardian rabbit hole with that one. I started reading everything over again that I could, and full of anxiety, fear and trembling over not fucking it up too badly, reinterpreting the text in light of Lemkin's concept of genocide. I think the interesting thing for our purposes now with mutual aid and Kropotkinsky here is Peter is that his preface to the 1914 edition, and incidentally as well Godwin's opening remarks to the Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, both of these anarchists begin their texts with with what appear to be warnings about genocide before that concept had been given its verbal form by Lemkin, in this case, about 130 years before Lemkin developed that term. It sounds like that's what they are talking about as pretty much the way I'm putting it is at the core of state power. It's something really essential to state power is war, conceived usually in terms of justified, falsely justified in terms of racism and groups of people going after other groups of people in extremely violent ways for completely vacuous reasons. So let's just leave it to Kropotkin here to say the rest, because he's a lot better at writing than I am at speaking here. So here we go. It says, when the present war began, involving nearly all Europe in a terrible struggle, and this struggle assumed in those parts of Belgium and France which were invaded by the Germans a never yet known character of wholesale destruction of life among the non-combatants and pillage of the means of subsistence of the civil population. Struggle for existence, scare quote, became a favorite explanation with those who tried to find an excuse for these horrors. So what's he saying there? Without the concept or the word genocide at Kropotkin's disposal, Kropotkin is still referring to the wholesale destruction of unarmed populations of people being excused by some, what turns out to be, as the book establishes, I think beyond any reasonable doubt, at least, they're using justifications based on bad science, fake science, pseudoscience, a complete misinterpretation of Darwinian natural selection, playing on his own mistakes with regard to his own theory that he was developing at the time, or that he had developed at the time. So yeah, just something to look out for, I think, is when Lemkin says that in his manuscript that he couldn't get funding for before he died at the age of 50, I think 4, 55, something like this, 51, I can't remember, sorry, but he died in his publisher's office of a heart attack. He's trying to secure funds for what would have been, I think, and it's still, even if in its massively incomplete form, I still consider it to be a masterpiece, and it wasn't even published until 2012, which is, like, what are these academics doing? I don't understand. He's got something like 10,000 pages of notes in 2 archives in New Jersey and New York, and there's one guy that's been looking at it for 20 years, and he's just sitting on it. He published one book of 700 pages, a big book, 500 pages, something like this, called Lemkin, under the title Lemkin on Genocide. Anyways, the outline for the study is a masterpiece of its own, I think. In that section, introductory section, Lemkin refers to not genocide, but the genos, what he's calling the genos, as, quote, well, quoting from memory, a new element in the study of history. So even the most what do you call kind of softly historical materialistic perspective doesn't have to be dialectical in a rigid Marxist way or otherwise. Anyone who thinks, I think correctly, that history and politics and culture, society, all very much belong together, particularly in terms of the fact that they are intergenerational, that they occur, they go down, they happen historically. So for anyone committed to that, I think, obvious truism about politics, yeah, what the hell was I talking about? I forgot. History is important for what? Oh yeah, there it is. So when Lemkin says that the genos is a new element in study of history, I think we can look at that in a kind of Thomas Kuhnian way, as a paradigm shift in politics, philosophy, history, you name it. When we look in terms of the genos and its destruction or its survival somehow through all of these, awful forms of life that are so destructive that you might as well. I mean, I think we can go further than what Kropotkin says here. It's not just that these wars, World War I in particular, involved a lot of armed pillage and destruction of people's means of subsistence, people that were civilians who were not even soldiers. This genocidal assault, in other words, on all of these civil populations wasn't just a destruction or a pillaging of the means of what Marx would call the means of production, but I like Kropotkin's phrase there, the means of subsistence, because a lot of them were peasant class or farmers subsisting, more or less for themselves. It didn't just destroy or pillage these things. It co-opted, I like to say co-opted the means of cooperation, and it turned the means of production into its opposite, into a means of destruction. Or the means of subsistence into a means of, the more or less gradual or historically speaking, way too fast decimation and destruction of those means of subsistence that comes down the line after they've been weaponized, turned against civil populations that are beholden to the gun standard and to the violence of the state in all of its countless forms, including personal forms like what we like to call here at the Getty Kruger running from president campaign headquarters, which is some quarter in my head rattling around, American quarter maybe, I don't know. We like to call that genocidal politeness, which is rampant around here. So much garbage, and ye shall know them by their mountains of garbage. I used to, feel a little guilty when I said that Canada had a trashy culture. But then when I was watching Wendy get messy on Wendy Nestle on the China Bashing Corporation show, CBC, one day, talking about recycling, or so-called, that Canada, like the study just came out a few months ago, Canada literally, produces more garbage per capita than any other military nation state weaponized mediocrity on planet Earth. It's including the Yankeeville downstairs that we like to pat our backs on being better than, which we're not. Or at least there's no way of measuring that kind of thing. But my suspicion is just be critical of your own culture before you go blaming other cultures that made your Walmart prices possible with child labor and such things. Don't even mention that when you're talking shit about Chinese people like they don't even live here on CBC, with people from King Street and Bay Street posing as experts who haven't even written, let alone probably even read an intelligent book about Chinese history or culture, don't speak a word of Mandarin or Cantonese, uttering talking points like, is Beijing just going to Beijing or what? Just do what it wants? What does that even mean? Take a look in your own disgusting backyard before you point the finger, because the finger's pointing in all directions. Both sides are worse. That's what it means to be in a shit sandwich. Top bread's just as bad as the bottom bread. There's a turd in the middle, okay? They're both worse. It's the state. Get over it. Competition's bullshit. Cooperation's the only reason we're still around. It's a miracle. Noam Chomsky is an anarchist. And, he revolutionized a scientific field as well, linguistics. In my opinion, Kropotkin's revolutionary amendment and political uptake of the theory of evolution, not to mention his contributions to deep geography and deep history, are on a par with Chomsky's revolutionary, change of linguistics. If anything, linguistics, Chomsky is still uncomfortable showing, if any, connection, if there are any, between his linguistic work, his theory of language and mind, and his political views. But Kropotkin's doing precisely that, but in the context of the newly emerging biological theory of evolution of his time. So, I mean, this Kropotkin should at least have a say in, I think, academic political philosophy when they're talking about politics, talking about their Hobbes and their Kant and all these statist cowards. They should at least have, even if just to laugh at him, just as a foil. The anarchist is just by default, there's something profoundly philosophical just about anarchism as it stands, because it is, as a product of the Enlightenment, like, for what it's worth, probably not much. It's this questioning of all authority. That's a philosophical stance. Chomsky doesn't, he doesn't reject authority per se. He rejects illegitimate authority based on coercion and force. I'm trying to do something similar in my dissertation pamphlet, just to, for the sake of just clarity, or whatever you want to call it, to make a distinction between force and power. Kind of pull the term power back from all of its misuse. You can say the president is the most powerful man, in the world, or something like this. Some guy that gets insulted when someone makes fun of his hands and needs people to drool his name while clapping for themselves and booing their boogeyman, scapegoat enemies. That's not a powerful person. That's a person who's really insecure and violent, and is impotent in a lot of ways. Maybe, well, in a lot of ways, let's just leave it there. Poor Melania. But I mean, it's not just that these paranoid dictators are impotent in their insecurity, but, what they depend on is the perceived impotence of crowds of atomized, exploited, confused, angry people. So a lot of impotency all the way around. And it's, to just put a gun in its hand and call it great, it's so much easier to just go on another killing spree after blaming the victim or blaming the more vulnerable people. It never ends well, even for the perpetrator, especially for the perpetrator, because then they're living, well, they're dead, eventually, like everybody, but they don't come out looking too good in the annals or the annals of colonial history.